Parents gave my brother everything until their favorite son ruined their lives. Hey everyone. I honestly never imagined I'd be posting something like this online, but I've reached a point where venting anonymously seems like the only way to keep my sanity. So, for context, my name's Ryan, I'm 29, and I recently learned exactly where I stood in my family in a way that absolutely blindsided me. It wasn't some carefully planned sit-down where my parents gently broke the news or anything. Nope, that would have required them to care about my feelings first. Instead, I discovered everything purely by chance, almost like fate wanted to slap me awake from the fantasy I'd been living in. For years, I'd been the quiet caretaker, the responsible older sibling keeping the family afloat. My younger brother, Alex, on the other hand, was the epitome of entitlement. At 25, he'd never worked a real job in his life, spent most of his time gaming or partying, and somehow still had my parents wrapped around his finger. They covered all his expenses, made excuses for his laziness, and bent over backward to ensure he never faced real-life consequences. Me? I was the independent one, meaning they didn't bother with me unless they needed something. I paid their bills, covered unexpected expenses, and fixed up their house countless times, hoping, stupidly, that they'd finally notice my sacrifices. But that acknowledgement never came. Anyway, a few months back, I was at my parents' house helping my dad organize some paperwork. Neither of them was tech-savvy, and anything more complicated than turning on the TV usually fell to me. As I scanned through the endless pile of documents, something caught my eye, a folder labeled Last Will. Now, I'm not the type to pry, but after years of bending over backward for them, curiosity won out. Besides, I'd been practically paying for their entire lives. It seemed fair to wonder how they'd set things up for the future. Opening the folder felt like opening Pandora's box. Inside were the words that changed everything. My parents had left absolutely everything to Alex. The house I'd helped them maintain, their savings, and even their modest investments. My name was nowhere, not a single mention except for a few empty lines about loving both sons equally. Equally? Really? It felt like a punch in the gut. Here I was, breaking my back to keep them comfortable while Alex lounged around without lifting a finger. And yet, in their eyes, he was the one deserving everything they'd built, or rather, everything I'd helped them build. My mind raced, anger mixing with disbelief. Had I always been their backup plan, their financial safety net without any intention of ever recognizing my efforts? The betrayal cut deep. I sat there frozen, staring at the pages until my dad finally wandered back in. "Ryan, what's the holdup?" he asked, mildly annoyed as if I were wasting his precious time. Without hesitation, I raised the papers, my voice cold. "Care to explain this?" His face went pale instantly, guilt flashing briefly across his features before he hardened again. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered defensively. "Really?" I snapped, my patience completely gone. "Because it looks like you're giving Alex everything after I've spent years supporting you." He shifted awkwardly, refusing to meet my gaze. "It's complicated. That was it. No apology. No explanation beyond two meaningless words. Just dismissive silence and a vague wave as if my emotions were some childish inconvenience he didn't want to deal with. Determined to hear both sides, I called for my mom. She entered hesitantly, instantly noticing the papers in my hand. Her expression turned remorseful, but her words only worsened things. "Honey," she said softly, her voice artificially soothing, "you're independent. You don't need anything from us. Alex, he struggles. We just wanted to make sure he's taken care of." That excuse was the final straw. Something snapped inside me. After years of quietly absorbing neglect and disrespect, I finally saw clearly. They weren't confused or misguided, they knew exactly what they were doing and had justified it fully in their minds. I carefully set the papers back on the table, my voice eerily calm. "Understood. Thanks for clarifying exactly where I stand." Then, without another word, I walked out of their house, ignoring their protests and the guilt-ridden pleas following me down the driveway. They had made their decision, and now it was time for me to make mine. As I drove home, my phone buzzed continuously with their calls and messages, but I didn't answer. They'd chosen their golden child, and now it was his turn to step up and care for them. If Alex truly deserved everything they had, surely he could handle their problems without my help. I spent the next 2 weeks enjoying a surprising peace I'd never known before. No frantic phone calls, no sudden bills landing on my doorstep. Just quiet independence. But peace like that doesn't last long, not with my family. Exactly 14 days after walking out, my dad finally broke the silence with a simple, cold text. "Mortgage is due soon." No hello, no apology, just an entitled reminder as if nothing had happened and I was still their endless source of free money. A bitter laugh escaped me as I read his message, realizing just how predictable they were. Taking a deep breath, I replied in a short, sweet message of my own. "Ask Alex. After all, he's your chosen one." As I hit send, satisfaction filled my chest. It was finally time they learned what life looked like without me bailing them out. But what I didn't know then was how far they'd go to drag me back in and how ruthless they'd get once they realized I wasn't coming back. I genuinely believed that message would mark the end of things, or at least begin a new chapter where my family accepted that they couldn't treat me like a walking ATM. But deep down I should have known better. When you've been the safety net your entire life, people don't easily accept that you've suddenly decided to walk away. 2 days after my reply, the phone calls started pouring in, not just from my parents, but extended family too. My Aunt Barbara was the first to reach out, and she wasted no time getting straight to the guilt trip. "Ryan," she began in her usual condescending tone, "your parents are really hurting. You know Alex isn't capable of handling things on his own. Why are you punishing them?" I took a long, steady breath. "Barbara, I've done more than enough. Alex has coasted for 25 years. It's time he learned some responsibility." She scoffed. "He's your brother. You can't turn your back on family." I laughed bitterly. Funny how family only matters when I'm the one paying. She sputtered, but I ended the call before she could argue further. Unfortunately, she wasn't alone. Uncles, cousins, and even my grandparents called to guilt-trip me. It was always the same script: Alex needs help, family supports family, your parents raised you, after all. As the pressure mounted, a small part of me nearly caved, briefly wondering if maybe I was being too harsh. But every time those doubts crept in, I remembered that, well, the clear, cold proof that my parents had chosen to cut me out entirely, even after everything I'd done. Then, one evening, just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Alex himself. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "What do you want, Alex?" I asked flatly. His tone was surprisingly desperate. "Hey, man. Look, things are getting crazy here. Mom and Dad are panicking. Bills are piling up. Can you just help out one last time?" I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. "No. They made their choice, and apparently so did you." Silence stretched across the line for a moment before Alex finally spoke again, bitterness seeping into his voice. "You really gonna hold the whole thing over our heads forever?" I laughed dryly. "Forever? It was 2 weeks ago. You can't seriously think I'm obligated to bail you all out after being cut off completely." His tone turned icy. "So that's it? You're just abandoning us? After everything Mom and Dad did for you? What exactly did they do, Alex?" I asked, finally losing patience. "Because from where I'm standing, I've done far more for them than they ever did for me." Alex sighed dramatically. "You know what, man? Fine. Do whatever. But don't come crying back to us when you're alone and regret this." Before I could reply, he hung up abruptly. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Alex, who'd relied on me for everything, was threatening me with isolation? It was almost comical. But beneath the frustration and anger, I felt a wave of sadness. It wasn't easy realizing the people who were supposed to support you were willing to discard you so effortlessly. Determined to distract myself, I poured all my energy into my own life. I took on extra shifts, upgraded my apartment, and finally pursued hobbies I'd ignored for years while being the family's fixer. Surprisingly, it felt incredible. I discovered peace and happiness weren't dependent on their approval or appreciation. For the first time, I genuinely started feeling whole without their constant drama. But, of course, my family wasn't done. They'd been quiet for a few days, and experience had taught me that silence always meant trouble. Sure enough, my phone buzzed late one night with a message that made my stomach drop. It wasn't another family member begging for money or throwing guilt, it was from my mom, brief and cold. "If you don't help us out, Ryan, we'll have no choice but to sell your grandmother's old property, the one you loved visiting as a kid. It's your call." I froze, my blood running cold. They'd found my weak spot. That house had been my refuge growing up, the only place I'd ever felt genuinely loved. After my grandma passed, my parents inherited it. They never cared for the place, often joking about how old and worthless it was. But they knew how much it meant to me. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. Rage, sadness, disbelief, they mixed in a storm that threatened to swallow me whole. This wasn't just manipulation. It was cruelty, intentional, calculated cruelty aimed at forcing my hand. For hours, I debated how to respond. Part of me desperately wanted to protect that old house, to preserve those precious childhood memories. But another part realized this was just another attempt to control me. By morning, clarity finally came. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me again, not even with the threat of losing something I cherished deeply. They crossed a line, and there was no going back. I typed my reply slowly, deliberately. "Do what you have to do. But understand this, when that house sells, you lose me permanently. No more favors, no more forgiveness." My finger hovered briefly over the send button, knowing this would alter everything forever. Then, without hesitation, I pressed it. Their reply came quickly, brief and harsh. "You'll regret this." I sighed, a strange sense of calm washing over me. They thought they still had power, but I'd finally freed myself. Yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. If my family was capable of going this far, I had no idea what they'd do next. And honestly, that scared me more than anything. I expected things to spiral quickly after that exchange, but oddly enough, nothing happened right away. No angry calls, no desperate texts, just silence. It felt eerie, like the calm before a storm. I kept expecting the other shoe to drop, bracing myself every time my phone lit up. Weeks passed, and slowly life returned to something resembling normal. Work kept me busy, and the distance I'd put between myself and my family seemed to grow with every quiet day that passed. Friends noticed the change too, telling me I seemed lighter, less burdened. I even started to believe I'd finally escaped my family's toxic grip. But one evening everything unraveled again. I was cooking dinner when my phone lit up with a notification from social media. Normally I'd ignore it, but something tugged at my curiosity. I clicked open the app and saw a post from my mom, one she'd purposely set to public, knowing I'd see it. My heart sank as I read her carefully constructed narrative. It's heartbreaking when a child you've loved and nurtured for years decides to abandon you in your darkest moments. Family is supposed to be there through thick and thin, but some people only think about themselves. We've had to make painful choices lately, including selling a beloved family property. All because someone we trusted turned their back on us when we needed them most. Below her words, supportive comments flooded in from relatives, friends, and even strangers. Dozens of voices condemned the selfish, ungrateful child. She hadn't named me directly, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. My hands shook with anger. They had ignored my struggles for years, drained my resources, and now they publicly painted me as the villain. I stared at the screen, emotions churning inside me. Part of me wanted to reply, to lay out every injustice I'd endured. But arguing online would only feed their narrative. Instead, I did something more satisfying. I deactivated my account entirely. Yet, the damage had been done. Almost instantly, texts poured in from acquaintances, distant cousins, and even old classmates, each expressing shock and disappointment in me. The weight of their judgment felt suffocating, even though I knew it was undeserved. Then came the real blow, a text from my grandmother's closest friend, Betty, who I'd known my whole life. "Ryan, I can't believe you'd let them sell your grandmother's place. She loved you dearly and would be devastated. I hope you're proud of yourself." Her words cut deeper than any insult ever could. Betty had always been kind to me, and knowing she'd fallen for their manipulative lies hurt more than I expected. I took a deep breath and carefully typed my reply. "Betty, if only you knew the full story. But I'm done explaining myself. Believe whatever you want." I turned off my phone, tossed it aside, and sat in silence. The betrayal burned fresh again, but alongside it grew a powerful realization: they were desperate because, for the first time, they couldn't control me. I knew then I needed to do something drastic, not revenge, not public arguments, but something that showed them I wouldn't tolerate their games anymore. A few days later, an idea formed in my mind. It was bold, risky even, but it felt right. If they wanted a war, I'd bring it to them in the only way they'd understand: financially. I made a call to a realtor I knew, pretending calmness as I asked about my grandmother's property. He confirmed exactly what I'd hoped. It was indeed up for sale. My parents had listed it at a price far below its real value. Probably desperate for quick cash. Perfect. Without hesitation, I arranged to buy the property myself, anonymously. I didn't care what it cost. It was the principle. I'd protect the home that had given me the happiest moments of my childhood and take away the last weapon my parents had against me. A week later, I walked into the realtor's office and signed the papers, officially reclaiming the house I'd loved so much. I felt strangely emotional, a mixture of victory and melancholy settling in my chest. But the satisfaction of this quiet victory was short-lived. Just hours after finalizing the purchase, my phone buzzed again, this time with a frantic call from Alex. I answered cautiously, expecting more anger, more guilt. Instead, his voice sounded panicked, raw with desperation. "Ryan, you need to come quick. It's Mom. She's collapsed. It's bad." All anger vanished instantly, replaced by ice-cold dread. "What happened?" I asked sharply, already grabbing my keys. "I don't know," Alex admitted shakily. "I found her on the floor, and Dad won't talk to me. We don't know what to do." I cursed quietly, racing toward my car. Despite everything, the thought of losing my mother filled me with anxiety. I wasn't prepared to say goodbye. Not yet, not like this. When I arrived, the scene that greeted me was chaotic. An ambulance stood parked outside, lights flashing ominously. Alex stood nearby, pale-faced and trembling, while paramedics worked quickly inside. My father stood motionless in the doorway, visibly shaken, eyes hollow as he watched them carry Mom into the ambulance. As they pulled away, I approached him cautiously. His face was pale, his arrogance stripped away by genuine fear. "What happened?" I asked gently. He met my eyes briefly, the weight of his choices visibly crashing down on him. She collapsed. Blood pressure, stress, they don't know yet. We stood quietly, the tension between us heavy yet oddly fragile. I'm sorry, he finally whispered, voice breaking. Ryan, I'm so sorry. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. It didn't erase the years of neglect, but it softened something inside me. Let's get to the hospital, I said quietly. At that moment, I knew my war with my family had reached a tipping point. My parents had pushed me away, betrayed me, tried to ruin me publicly. But now, when tragedy struck, I still showed up. Yet, despite this truce born out of crisis, I had no illusions. Peace was fragile, and forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. But as I drove toward the hospital, one question burned relentlessly in my mind. Had I just fallen back into their trap? Or had this crisis given us one last chance to finally heal? Sitting in that sterile hospital waiting room was surreal. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, the fluorescent lights buzzing quietly overhead. Alex paced anxiously, chewing on his nails, while my dad sat motionless, eyes glazed over, staring at nothing. It felt strange to be back among them after everything, like stepping into an old movie whose ending I already knew. Finally, after what felt like hours, the doctor emerged, clipboard in hand and a neutral expression on her face. Your mom's stable now, she said softly, sensing our collective anxiety. It was severe stress-induced hypertension. She'll need plenty of rest, reduced stress, and consistent care. Can we see her? Alex asked immediately, desperation clear in his voice. The doctor hesitated briefly before nodding. She's awake, but she needs calm right now. One visitor at a time. Alex moved toward the door, but to my surprise, Dad spoke up quietly. Ryan should go first. Alex shot him an incredulous look, but Dad didn't meet his eyes. He deserves it. Surprised and unsettled, I nodded slowly and entered my mom's room, unsure of what to expect. She lay in bed, pale and small beneath the blankets, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen. Her eyes found mine immediately, filled with regret. Ryan, she whispered weakly, reaching out her hand. I moved closer, cautious but gentle. Mom, she gripped my hand, her touch soft and tremulous. I messed up. I hurt you so badly. I never saw how wrong we were until now. My throat tightened painfully. I'd spent so long waiting to hear those words, and now they felt strange, bittersweet, almost unreal. You deserved better, she continued quietly. We took you for granted, used you as our safety net, and when you stopped accepting it, we lashed out instead of looking inward. I'm so sorry, Ryan. Truly. I sat there in stunned silence. For the first time, she wasn't making excuses. She wasn't shifting blame. She was genuinely sorry. The sincerity in her voice tugged at the corners of my long-hardened heart. I appreciate you saying that, I finally said, my voice gentle but firm. But it doesn't erase what's happened. I know, she said quietly, and I won't ask you to forget. But I hope someday, somehow, we can move past this. Before I could reply, a nurse stepped in gently to remind me that she needed rest. I nodded, squeezed Mom's hand softly, and left the room, emotions swirling inside me. Alex and Dad were waiting outside. Without saying much, I told them she was stable and walked away. I needed fresh air, space, clarity, anything but this suffocating tension. Standing alone outside the hospital, I took a deep breath, feeling my lungs expand. I felt conflicted. My mother's apology had cracked something inside me, years of hardened resentment and carefully built walls. But was it enough? Days passed. Mom gradually recovered and I checked in often, but I kept my distance from Dad and Alex. The tension was still there, though subtly shifting. I could feel the unspoken questions hovering, the unresolved issues waiting in the wings. Everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid to shatter whatever fragile peace we'd found. Eventually, Mom returned home and life settled into a new, awkward normal. I expected another shoe to drop at any moment, for demands to start again, for guilt trips and manipulation to resume their old patterns. Strangely, things stayed calm. Then, one evening, Dad knocked quietly on my apartment door. When I opened it, he looked unsure, almost humbled. Can we talk? He asked softly. We sat down awkwardly at my kitchen table. My father, a man I'd rarely seen show any vulnerability, took a shaky breath before speaking. I know saying sorry won't fix things, he began slowly, staring at his weathered hands resting on the table. Your mother's illness woke me up. I realized how deeply we failed you. He paused, taking another breath. The will, we're changing it. Everything was wrong. You deserve so much more than we ever gave you. I studied him silently, absorbing the weight of his words. Dad, it was never about money. It was about respect. About feeling like part of the family. He nodded slowly, regret deepening in his eyes. We made mistakes, Ryan. Huge ones. I just hope someday you can forgive us. For the first time in my life, my dad was genuinely apologizing, without conditions, without defenses. It was raw and honest, and part of me wanted to let go of all the pain right then and there. But the wounds still felt fresh, deep, and impossible to erase quickly. I finally spoke, carefully choosing my words. Forgiveness might come eventually. But trust? That's going to take time. He nodded, accepting this quietly. After a moment, he stood up, gently squeezing my shoulder before leaving. When he was gone, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, absorbing everything that had happened. Just weeks ago, they'd left me feeling worthless, replaced by their favorite child. Now, they were facing the harsh reality of their choices, and I was finally seeing clearly. Yet, despite their apologies, I still felt conflicted. Forgiveness didn't come easy, and maybe it never would. But for now, I realized something far more important, something I'd never considered before. I didn't need their validation to feel worthy. Their acknowledgement felt good, sure, but it wasn't what defined me. I'd always felt I had to earn their respect, but now I knew I'd been seeking something I should have granted myself a long time ago. So, while the pain they caused was real and still raw, I felt lighter, stronger, somehow. I wouldn't return to being their fallback plan, but maybe, eventually, I could forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for once I felt ready to face it on my terms. Or at least, I thought I was ready until the next unexpected twist completely changed everything once again. After the conversation with my dad, I tried my best to move forward. Life went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the intensity of family drama began to fade into the background again. But, of course, peace never lasted very long around here. About a month later, just as I'd started getting comfortable in my newfound freedom, I got an email from my parents' lawyer. My stomach tightened as I opened it, bracing myself for more drama. Instead, I found a notification that hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents had revised their will. For a split second, I felt hopeful. Maybe they'd reconsidered their earlier cruelty, maybe they'd finally understood how hurtful their actions were. But as I kept reading, hope faded rapidly. They hadn't changed their will to make things fair. Instead, they'd cut me out completely, officially leaving their entire estate, house, savings, investments, to Alex again. Only this time, they'd made it crystal clear there was no ambiguity, no apologies. The lawyer's note stated simply that my parents considered Alex to have more pressing financial needs, and I was capable enough to succeed independently. As I read those words, anger and betrayal surged inside me all over again. They were still punishing me for being responsible. They were still treating me like a fallback plan. But this time, I didn't sit quietly. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed my father directly, hands shaking with barely contained fury. When he picked up, his tone was strangely flat. I assume you saw the changes. I bit back my anger, keeping my voice steady. Yeah, I saw them. Mind explaining. My father sighed deeply, irritation creeping into his voice. Look, Ryan, it's not personal. I cut him off sharply. Not personal? You disinherited me. Again. He hesitated. We discussed this. Alex needs more support. You're fine on your own. The coldness in his voice was chilling. This wasn't the remorseful father who sat in my kitchen, begging for forgiveness. This was the same man who'd always ignored my sacrifices, rationalizing his cruelty with twisted logic. Fine, I snapped bitterly, unable to hold back my hurt. You've made your choice. I hung up, feeling emptier than ever. But after a few days of quiet rage, a strange calmness overtook me. My parents had shown their true colors permanently. There was no misunderstanding, no room for excuses anymore. They weren't my family. They were just two people I'd wasted years trying to please. Then, one evening, my phone lit up again. It was Alex, my golden child brother, the one person I least expected to hear from now. What do you want? I asked, voice guarded. Alex sounded awkward, uncertain. Hey, listen about the will. I swear I didn't ask for that. Mom and Dad just did it. I never wanted to hurt you. I felt my jaw clench. Sure, Alex. Must be tough getting everything handed to you. He hesitated, sounding genuinely uncomfortable. I know it looks bad, but honestly, I think they're wrong. I mean, you're my brother. I'd never intentionally do this to you. I paused, caught off guard. It was rare for Alex to show vulnerability. You could have told them that, I said, my voice softer. He sighed heavily. You know how they are. I never argued because it was easier not to. His honesty surprised me. Alex was privileged, selfish at times, but not malicious, not intentionally anyway. Hearing his discomfort made me reconsider slightly. Listen, he continued, sounding genuinely remorseful. They've been fighting non-stop. I think they're regretting it now. Maybe you could talk to them? I shook my head slowly. I'm done trying to prove myself to them. They made their choice clear. Alex sighed again, clearly conflicted. I understand. But for what it's worth, I think they messed up. Yeah, well, I replied quietly. Doesn't change anything. We hung up shortly after, leaving me lost in thought. I'd always assumed Alex enjoyed his status as the favorite. Hearing his guilt made things messier, but it didn't erase the damage. Still, it made me realize something important. My resentment toward Alex wasn't the real issue. It was the years of favoritism from my parents that had hurt so deeply. Days passed quietly. I kept busy, burying myself in work, trying desperately to forget my family existed at all. And for a while, it seemed to work. Suddenly, my phone buzzed yet again. This time, the call was from Aunt Barbara. I nearly ignored it, expecting another lecture, but curiosity got the better of me. Ryan, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard. I owe you an apology. My eyebrows shot up. You? She laughed bitterly. Yes, me. After hearing what happened, I started asking questions. The deeper I dug, the clearer things became. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. They manipulated us all, she admitted sadly. Told us you'd chosen to leave the family, that you didn't care. They painted you as selfish, ungrateful, but now I know the truth. Her honesty caught me completely off guard. You didn't deserve any of this, she said firmly. And I'm so sorry we believed their lies. I sat there stunned. Aunt Barbara, the family matriarch, the queen of judgment, apologizing? Felt surreal. I appreciate you saying that, I finally replied. It means a lot. She sighed gently. If there's anything you need, Ryan, anything, I'm here. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Barbara's apology was a tiny victory amidst the chaos, but it mattered more than I realized. For the first time, someone else in my family had acknowledged the truth. I took that moment of validation, feeling a small sense of healing beginning to form. But what came next was even more shocking. The next morning, I woke up to an email notification, once again from my parents' lawyer. With dread, I opened it cautiously, but the contents left me speechless. My parents had reversed their will again. Only this time, everything was left entirely to me. I stared at the words, disbelief twisting in my gut. After everything, the arguments, the anger, the betrayal, they were suddenly handing me everything? It made no sense. Something was off. As I sat staring at the screen, my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice frantic, panicked. Ryan, we need your help. Please, it's Alex, something's happened. At that moment, my heart sank as I realized the truth. They weren't rewarding me. They were using me again, and whatever had happened to Alex, they expected me to fix it. But this time, I wasn't going to let them drag me down again. I was done playing their games, and this crisis would finally teach them that lesson once and for all. My mom's frantic voice echoed in my ear, bringing back memories of every panicked call I'd received over the years, calls that always came with demands disguised as pleas for help. Ryan, please, she sobbed into the phone, desperation evident. Alex got into trouble. It's really bad this time. I took a long, steady breath, trying not to react impulsively. What happened? She hesitated, clearly struggling. Alex borrowed money from some people, dangerous people. He couldn't pay them back, and now they're threatening him, threatening us. My stomach churned with a mix of concern and frustration. Of course, Alex's irresponsibility had finally caught up with him. Naturally, my parents' first instinct was to run to me for help. How much? I asked quietly, already dreading the answer. She hesitated again, her voice barely audible. 50,000. My heart stopped. $50,000? Yes, she whispered, sounding terrified. We tried everything. Loans, savings, nothing worked. You're the only one who can fix this. Those last words sliced through me, stirring years of resentment. Once again, I was the fixer, the only reliable option when everything else failed. I clenched my jaw, taking a moment before responding. And this is why you suddenly changed the will back to me, isn't it? To guilt me into fixing another mess. My mom fell silent, confirming my suspicion. I'm not your emergency fund, I finally said, keeping my voice steady. Alex made this mess. He needs to clean it up himself. Ryan, you don't understand, she tried to argue, panic rising again. I understand perfectly, I snapped, interrupting her. You disowned me until you needed me again. But this time it's not going to work. I ended the call before she could reply, my pulse pounding in my ears. But despite my anger, guilt gnawed at me relentlessly. Alex was careless, entitled, frustrating, but he was still my brother. If something genuinely bad happened to him, could I live with myself? I spent the next 2 days pacing anxiously, wrestling with my conscience. But every time my resolve weakened, memories of how they treated me came flooding back, years of neglect, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. Then, as I sat alone in my living room one evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Alex himself, his voice strained, barely recognizable. Ryan, listen, he said urgently, his breathing ragged. I don't deserve your help, but please, you're my last hope. I hesitated, emotions swirling chaotically. Alex, you've made mistake after mistake, and every time I cleaned up the mess. When does it stop? He exhaled slowly, defeated. I know. I never learned because you always bailed me out. But this is different. These guys, they're serious. I'm scared, man. Hearing genuine fear in his voice made my heart ache. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was their own making, years of entitlement finally exploding. I'll help you, I finally said quietly, but this is it. Understand? After this, I'm done. Alex breathed heavily, relief audible in his voice. I swear, Ryan. I'll never ask you for anything again. And despite my reservations, part of me hoped he truly meant it this time. Within days, I managed to pull together the money, mostly from savings I'd carefully built, intending never to spend on family drama again. Paying off Alex's debt was painful, a bitter reminder of their power over me. But afterward, a strange calm settled over my family. Alex kept his word, he distanced himself, taking responsibility for once, determined to rebuild his life independently. My parents, shocked by how close they'd come to real disaster, retreated quietly, too embarrassed to demand anything else. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself free from the constant burden of their expectations. I rebuilt my savings, poured energy back into my own life, and slowly began healing the wounds left by years of mistreatment. I heard occasionally from Aunt Barbara, who had become a surprising source of support, checking in without judgment or pressure. But otherwise, my family stayed silent, finally respecting my boundaries. Just when I thought the drama was finally behind me for good, though, another email arrived from the family lawyer. At first, I didn't even open it, dreading another manipulative tactic. But curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the message open, eyes scanning the text nervously. My breath caught sharply. My parents had revised the will one final time, and now, shockingly, they divided their assets evenly between Alex and me. Attached was a short note from my mother, simply reading. Ryan, we're finally trying to make things right. We can't erase the past, but we hope this shows you that we're sincere. We're deeply sorry. I sat back, stunned. For the first time, they'd acknowledged both sons equally, not out of desperation, but seemingly out of genuine remorse. Yet, despite this unexpected gesture, I realized something profound. Their validation didn't matter anymore. I'd spent years craving their approval, chasing after their acceptance, but now I'd found peace on my terms. Their acknowledgement was nice, sure, but I no longer needed it to feel whole. As I closed the email, a sense of closure settled in my chest, warmer and more genuine than I'd ever imagined possible. Finally, after years of heartache, betrayal, and endless drama, I was free. And this time, nothing and no one was ever going to take that away from me again. After that email, things settled down in a way I'd never experienced before. The chaos, manipulation, and resentment that had defined my family for years seemed to evaporate, replaced by a cautious calmness that felt almost surreal. Life moved forward as it always does. Weeks became months, and slowly my interactions with my family became infrequent, distant, and surprisingly peaceful. Alex kept his promise, pulling his life together in a way I'd never thought possible. He got a steady job, moved into his modest apartment, and for the first time learned what independence truly meant. My parents, humbled by how badly things had unraveled, stayed mostly quiet. Occasionally they'd reach out, polite but careful, as though wary of reopening old wounds. I accepted their cautious olive branches, brief calls, or neutral holiday greetings, but I kept my emotional distance, knowing how easily old patterns could resurface. One afternoon, about a year after everything had settled, my phone buzzed again, displaying Alex's name. For once, my heart didn't sink at the sight. Instead, I felt genuine curiosity. Hey, Ryan, Alex began, sounding oddly mature. Can we meet? It's important. We met at a cafe a few hours later. When Alex walked in, he looked healthier, more stable than I'd ever seen him. We made small talk at first, work, hobbies, trivial things, but finally, he got to the point. I wanted you to hear this from me first, he began slowly, his eyes meeting mine seriously. Mom and Dad are selling their house. They've decided to downsize. I blinked, stunned. The family home, the one they'd fought so hard to protect, the center of their world, was being sold? Why? I asked, genuinely surprised. Alex leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. They realized how toxic it was to hold onto things, property, grudges, even expectations. They want a fresh start. And you? I asked carefully. He smiled slightly, genuinely, and free of bitterness. Honestly, I think it's a good thing. It'll help us all move on. I nodded slowly, absorbing this. Does this mean they're genuinely changing? He shrugged thoughtfully. Maybe. They're trying at least. We parted ways soon after, but his words lingered. It felt strangely liberating to think of that house, the physical symbol of their favoritism, judgment, and manipulation, finally being sold, its hold on our family broken forever. A few weeks later, while sorting through mail, I found an unexpected letter from my parents. Inside was a simple handwritten note. Ryan, we're moving forward with our lives and we know you are too. We deeply regret how we've treated you, but we're proud of the man you've become without our help. We hope someday you'll forgive us fully, but until then, please know you're always welcome in our lives. For the first time, reading their words didn't fill me with bitterness or sadness. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of closure. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed them, it was something I needed for myself. Holding on to resentment had drained me for too long. Maybe they had genuinely changed, maybe not. Either way, I'd moved beyond needing their validation or apologies. Months later, when news arrived that the family home had officially sold, I felt strangely unaffected. That chapter had finally closed and I was ready for what came next. On a quiet afternoon, I drove to my grandmother's old house, the one I'd saved from my parents' manipulation. I walked through its rooms, filled with memories, laughter, and moments of genuine love I'd felt from her as a child. Standing there, I made a decision. I'd restore the place, not just as a memorial of happier times but as a place of healing, a sanctuary where I'd build new memories, new friendships, and a life free from the shadows of my family's past. Weeks later, as renovations began, I found myself smiling, genuinely and freely, for the first time in years. I'd spent so long fighting to be seen, respected, and valued by people who couldn't see beyond their own biases. But now, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared, family members who finally understood, and a life I'd built purely by my efforts, I realized something powerful. The best revenge wasn't proving anyone wrong, it was simply living a life that made me genuinely happy. And that was exactly what I planned to do. Finally, free from the burden of their expectations, their manipulation, and their drama, I stepped forward into a future that was wholly and beautifully my own. Hope you enjoyed this story as much as I do. Help this small channel grow by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. Every bit of support means the world. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.